欢迎大家来到我们的学习频道 Foreigners Mandarin Guide， 我是孔老师。今天呢，我怀着无比激动的心情来迎接来自世界各地的你们，也欢迎朋友们在评论区告诉我你们分别来自哪些国家，我想认识一下大家。那么呢，今天我们将通过这个视频一起学习中文拼音的发音。我个人相信，掌握好拼音是学好中文的第一步，所以从拼音就得打好基础，这是非常非常的重要。好了，那么我们还是继续学习吧。Now, yet again, we meet a class of sounds that probably don't exist in some languages, but that's the beauty. If every language was the same, then it would be boring to learn new languages. The reason we find new languages so interesting is because they probably have a set of things that we don't have in our own native languages. Now, this group of g, k, h, there will be probably some sounds that some students may find a little tricky, but don't worry. The front part, the one I've used yellow to indicate, shows us the characteristics. In other words, the things we have to note down as we pronounce these sounds. Number one, they'll require us to have a specific position of the tongue in the mouth. And secondly, some will be aspirated sounds. In other words, the amount of air you gush out speaking some sounds is probably not the same you gush out speaking the other. Let us see it in practical use. Okay, family, let's see these three sounds. Now, g, k, h, even though I put the h in between, let's go with the g first. G, k. Now, there is a part of the tongue, in Chinese we call it shogen, shogen. Shogen, which would be, let's see, if you had your tongue drawn out, the tip of the tongue is one part, and then there is that immediate part just after the tip, just behind the tip. And probably every time you're taking sour medicine, the part you land the medicine onto. And then there is what I call the almost into the throat part of the tongue. Now that part, if you are keen to notice, every time you're pronouncing g, 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 that part will raise up to touch to your upper part of the mouth. Now that part, every time you pronounce it and the tongue touches and blocks the air coming from the throat, you'll pronounce that g, g, g. In other words, for g and k, which is the k, you'll notice that the tongue will always get in contact with the upper part of the mouth. All the time. G, k. Now, obviously, this brings us to one question. If both have the same position of the tongue in the mouth, how then can we differ them? Now, that brings us to the second characteristic. G doesn't carry as much air as the k. So with g, 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 k, 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 k. Every time I say it's an aspirated sound, you could use a paper and just put it in front of your mouth to see, are you gushing out as much air? Now with k, 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 you require a lot of air. With g, 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 it is soft and you do not require to gush out as much air. Then with h, the position of the tongue will not change. However, it will not touch the upper part of the mouth. It is attempting to touch, but then in the process, just before it touches, you will have pronounced the h. That is the sound. You do not need to exaggerate it. I usually hear students just after learning this, it's not a big problem, but it sounds a little weird if they're always exaggerating the sound. You do not need to make it sound so strange. It's simply you're raising your tongue, and just before it touches the upper part of your mouth, you're already saying huh. Okay, now next in line is ji. Now I must tell you guys, I have a couple of students that probably have lived in the southern part of China and been with a specific group of Nanfangren a long time that will pronounce this sound by using the tip of the tongue and letting it touch just the back part of the teeth to pronounce ji, and it will come out as a very sharp sound and I think it has this slight whistle to it. Now, I'll tell you point blank, it is a wrong part of the tongue to use when pronouncing these sounds. I'm gonna tell you exactly which part of the tongue to use. So the tongue, the air, and the lips are going to be very important. Now, why I said lips in brackets is because I do not mean that your lips have to move a certain way for this sound to come out. However, in the beginning, I would highly advise you pronounce it the exact same way I'm going to show you in this video, because it will help you pronounce it better. And secondly, as time goes on, as you become more fluent, you do not need to use those exaggerated mouth shapes, I guess. Now, let me take you through exactly how to pronounce this. Okay, let us begin with ji. Now, these sounds, I would immediately begin by telling you exactly where we're placing our tongue and where not to place your tongue. For most learners in the beginning, if their teacher did not put as much emphasis as they should on telling the students about the position of the tongue, they will probably just try to imitate what teacher is saying, but a couple of them usually put the tongue in a wrong position and learn the wrong way to pronounce them. Now, I'll tell you, you could use the tip of the tongue just behind the teeth, just at the part behind the upper teeth, to produce something that sounds a little similar to these sounds, right? I'll try pronouncing it. The only problem with that is it's too sharp, and for most times when you're speaking, it requires a little bit of effort. I mean, you could train your tongue to speak that way, but we don't usually speak that way. It's only in cases where you really have to maybe sing in opera, that you're required to speak those sounds in an exaggerated way. So the right way to do this is we're going to use this part of our tongue that I'm showing you right now. This one. Yes, exactly. 手面前. Now, you're going to raise it, and at the moment it touches your upper jaw, right? The moment it touches your upper jaw, you're going to be able to pronounce the sound ji. How does this sound come out? Because there is an obstruction of air. There was air trying to escape and you blocked it with your tongue. So that in return will cause you to pronounce the sound ji. Now imagine you just blocked an amount of air. So in the beginning, if you're not so conversant with these sounds, I would advise you use this mouth shape, okay? Try pronouncing them using this mouth shape and see, just to provide air with enough room to escape. As you learn more and more, as you become more and more fluent, you do not require to do these funny shapes, okay? You could speak normally, as long as the sound is correct, that's all required. But in the beginning, let's use this mouth shape and let our mouth get used to this sound. Ji. Now, the second sound, use more air than the one we've been using, because with ji, all that we did was a little vibration, a bit of air, and that was it. We could produce it. Now with ji, what separates it from ji is the amount of air we release, okay? So ji. Imagine yourself trying to say church, but from that position, like ji. T, T, as the tongue is in that position. Mind your tongue position, mind your mouth shape as well. It's an aspirated sound, so I expect those that find trouble with T and T, use a paper. Now with T, make sure the paper is blown away from your face. T, 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 T. Okay? Beautiful. Now with the Shi, the only difference is the tongue tried to reach, but it did not firmly get into contact with the upper part of your jaw. In other words, what produces this sound is the fact that as your tongue tried to reach out, the obstruction was not strong enough to stop the air from escaping, and in return, you ended up producing this sound. So it's shi, 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 shi. There is barely any touching of the tongue with the upper jaw. So you produce the sound shi, shi, shi. And this one, I'll tell you, it's probably not a sound that many languages have. So if you are also mastering this sound, well, you're taking a big step into learning Chinese. I mean, nice. In a way that makes you feel like, oh, I now know a different language. Okay, so that is GTC. Okay, family, now let's tackle these 4 syllables. Now, for these ones, we'll just require the tip of the tongue. I'm going to exactly tell you where you need to put it. And now, same as the group we've just covered before, I require you to at least use your lips in a weird shape. You're going to frame them in a weird way, in a weird manner, just for the beginning. And when you have learned this, when you have mastered them, you do not need to always form your mouth in a weird shape. I mean, nobody does that in real life. But for the beginning, because our target is to sound better than most Chinese, because I'll tell you, I don't mean to brag, but you can speak Chinese better than most Chinese themselves. Because 普通话, the language we are learning right now, it has a standard. Now let's dive right in and I show you exactly where to put your tongue. Okay, Mandarin warriors, this brings us to the next set, to the next class of consonants that we'll be learning in this video, which is zhi, chi, shi, zhi, chi, shi. Now, I find this really interesting as a person. It's more to do with the tongue than it has anything to do with the mouth shape, really. And I'll tell you in a few seconds exactly why I say so. Now, let's begin by immediately telling everyone watching this video exactly why I say it has everything to do with the tongue position. This part we see right now is called the 舌尖. So when you use the 舌尖 front part, 舌尖前, and you curve it inwards and raise it to touch your upper jaw. We've all had the experience, probably when we were young. We try to lick within our own mouths. You know exactly how the upper jaw is formed. There is this part just before you get into the throat. It feels a little soft. And then there is a part just behind the teeth in the upper jaw that feels hard. Okay? Now, between the two would be the middle of the upper jaw, the middle of your mouth. Now, raise your tongue as if you're trying to reach out to that area. And at the moment the tongue gets in touch with that area, did you feel it? Now, slightly curl it inwards as you're doing that, okay? Now, at the moment it gets in touch with that part, say zh, zh, zh. What produces this sound is actually the air that is blocked. Air is trying to escape, but you've already blocked it with your tongue. And the tongue stays in that position as you're pronouncing that sound. Now, why do people that pronounce this sound in the very beginning, and those that try to teach it in the very beginning, always tell you to have this kind of mouth shape? It has a lot to do with the fact that when you do this mouth shape, you release the air that is coming from inside. So it helps this sound not to change into other sounds as you're trying to release that air out of your mouth, okay? So every time you're saying j, try to use this mouth mouth shape in the beginning, not particularly because it's the shape of the mouth trying to produce the sound. It has everything to do with, it helps this air gush out, okay? With time, as you learn and get more fluent, you can ignore some of these hacks. I'm speaking about the mouth shape, just to be clear. Of course, the position of the tongue, this is something you'll have to practice probably every now and then until your tongue is comfortable speaking in that position. So, j, j, j. Then a few students may ask, 老师, then what is the difference between j and ch in this case? If you have trouble differentiating these two, remember, we have a difference of some sounds being aspirated. What I basically mean is they have more sound that will be released from the mouth while pronouncing them. Now this happens to be in that category, okay? So the difference between j and ch is the amount of air that you release. With ch, I really have to release a lot of air. I have to force out a lot of air, but my tongue will still stay in the same position as it were when I was pronouncing the first one. So ch, try to think of church, right? And try to pronounce that word while the tongue stays in that position. Did you feel it? Okay. Ch. Please note, every sound I say, I do not use the E sound, which is very sharp, and it's actually said as the tongue rests and lets the air out. No, all these sounds include blocking the air, so it's always sounding like an R at the end of these sounds, okay? J, ch. Now let's dive right in, and I tell you exactly how you're going to pronounce the third one. Remember that position of the tongue? Now, all the previous two required you to keep your tongue very firm onto the upper jaw for you to be able to block the air and pronounce these sounds. With this one, this is the one that does not require you to hold your tongue so firmly onto your upper jaw. Reason being, the way you pronounce it is after a little bit of air escapes. You tried to block it, but it escaped. In other words, as you're trying to reach out to get in contact with that part of the upper jaw, the air escapes and you pronounce the word sh. Remember, it's a silent R at the end, not an I that is so sharp as E. No, it's sh. Beautiful. Okay, the tongue slightly touches, but not too much, because it has to let some air escape. And remember the mouth shape in the beginning to help us really grasp these things. Now let's see. This one is a sound that in the very beginning, every time they were teaching this set of sounds, was never included. It is only something that researchers have found to be very vital to teach alongside these other sounds to enable students to realize that the position of the tongue actually is the same. The only difference being in the fact that with r, I simply vibrate instead of focusing on blowing out air, on releasing air from my mouth. So r, a little vibration can really get you sorted, and you will be pronouncing this with ease. R, but the position of my tongue will remain the same. Now, if you're still having trouble, I would advise you start from r, and then go to j, exactly. And the more you pronounce them, the more your ears will get used to them. And at the moment when your ears can actually listen out for the difference, imagine yourself seated down and listening to somebody saying them. If you can listen to somebody and be able to identify which of these they said, then that's the moment you can rest and not practice as much. But before you get there, I would advise do thorough drills on these, okay? do a lot of drills. Let your brain, let your whole system, let your tongue, let your mouth get used to these sounds. Okay, for this next part, I want to keep this video short. We are going to have to use the tip of the tongue as well as the teeth. I have friends of mine that come from the south. Every time they're pronouncing this sound, probably still will have a little bit of sharpness to it. Now for z, I'm just going to read a D, Z, and an I. A D, Z, and an I. Okay, D, Z, I. Z, Z, Z. And remember, we don't have E. We don't say Z. No. It's Z, Z, Z inside. The sound is from inside, okay? So Z is the first one. Where is my tongue as I speak these ones? Z. I will use the tip of my tongue to touch the back part of my teeth. Z, Z. And just at the moment when it touches, I'll use a little air and pronounce the first one. The difference between them is something we're going to see on the next page. And then with the S, it's also something that just requires a little technique. Z, Z, Z doesn't require too much air. S, 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 on the other hand, you have to use a little bit of energy as well as a lot of air from your mouth. Okay, that's the only difference. The position of the tongue is exactly the same. So, for those trying to learn them, try to say D and Z together. Z, Z, Z. And then for the second one, try to say T and S, T, S together. T, S, S, like that. And then the S, on the other hand, which is S in this case, non-C, non-C. No, it's non-C in English. Okay, it's S, S, S. Just before the tongue presses too hard onto the teeth, you will let the air escape. S, 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 S. In other words, it doesn't have to touch and get firm onto the teeth. Which now brings us to the last set. Yi, woo, yi, woo, yi, yi, woo, woo, yi. Now one, the yi, I say it while smiling. Make a big smile from ear to ear. You did it? Okay, now say yi, yi. Now with the woo, point your mouth forward as though you're going to kiss. Woo, woo. Perfect. Perfecto. Now you have learned and mastered all the 21 sounds in Chinese.